I wiped a table at the lodge, and my son's wife said, "We don't tip people who clean for a living." Then I looked her in the eyes and said, "This is my lodge." She'd been here 2 hours. Enough time to decide she had the place figured out. I'm in flannel, clearing tables, topping off coffee. She sees a weekend hire. Her husband, my son, is somewhere on his phone. She ordered wine without looking up, asked me to wipe a smudge that wasn't there. When I straightened up, she was holding out a $5 bill. "You can use this," she said. "I appreciate honest work." I took the 5, folded it, put it in my shirt pocket. Let me back up, because the context matters. I grew up in this county, born here, went to school here, never really left except for 2 years after high school when I tried college and discovered I was built for a different kind of education. I came back at 21 with nothing particular to show for it and took the first job that would have me. That was at Cedar Hollow, which at the time was not my lodge. It belonged to a man named Earl Whitestone, who had built it in the mid-50s out of timber. He'd cut himself off the surrounding hillside. Earl was 63 when I showed up asking about dishwasher work, and he had a way of watching people that felt less like surveillance and more like study, like he was trying to figure out what they were made of. I was made of stubbornness and necessity. My father had worked at the paper mill 30 years and retired with bad knees and a pension that covered the basics, if you didn't ask too much of the word basics. My mother cleaned houses 3 days a week until she couldn't. They were good people who worked hard and ended up with just enough, and I had watched that trajectory my whole childhood and decided somewhere around 14 that I wanted a different one. Not because I thought I was better than them, because I loved them and didn't want to worry the way they worried. So I showed up at Cedar Hollow at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in March and asked Earl for a job. He looked at my hands, asked if I had a problem with early mornings, and put me on the dishes that same day. I was the youngest person there by about 12 years. The kitchen smelled like bacon grease and dish soap and pine from the logs stacked near the back entrance, and on my first morning I burned my forearm on the pot rack and thought I'd made a serious mistake. By the end of the week, I thought I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I won't claim I was exceptional from day one, but I showed up every shift. I came in early when they needed coverage. When the line cook called in sick on a Saturday with 40 rooms booked, I offered to help prep, and Earl watched me do it without saying much, and at the end of the night he said I had decent instincts and to come back Monday and he'd show me some things. He spent the next several months teaching me the kitchen the way a craftsman teaches an apprentice, without fanfare, by demonstration and repetition, and the occasional sharp correction when I got lazy. By 24, I was running prep on weeknights. By 26, I was floor manager Thursday through Sunday. I wasn't making much money, but I was learning the entirety of how a hospitality operation worked, and there is no school that teaches it the way doing it does. I knew the plumbing. I knew which room had the draft near the east window every November, and what length of draft guard solved it. I knew that table 7 in the dining room sat slightly uneven on its southwestern leg, and you needed a matchbook underneath to keep the water glasses from trembling when people walked past. Earl had never fixed it. I asked him about it once, and he said, "Some things in a place have character, and some things are just broken, and it's your job to know the difference." I have been thinking about that sentence ever since. In 1991, I married my wife. She grew up about 30 miles from here, daughter of a dairy farmer, and she was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately saw what needed doing, and started doing it without anyone asking. She loved Cedar Hollow from the first time I brought her here. Not the way some people love a place because it photographs well, but the way you love something that feels like it was already part of you before you found it. She started helping on weekends during the busy season, just informally at first. Within 2 years, she had reorganized the reservation system, redesigned the menu layout, and sourced the apple butter from her cousin's farm in Pennsylvania, which we still sell at the front desk and which guests ask about by name. We had our son 8 years into our marriage. He came 2 weeks early, weighed 6 pounds 4 ounces, and had his mother's nose in my ears. He was a quiet, curious kid, more comfortable with books than with people, which made me think of myself at that age. He took to the lodge the way his mother had. He knew the staff by name by the time he was 5. He used to do his homework at the corner table in the dining room on weekday afternoons, and the servers would bring him hot chocolate without being asked. Earl sold me Cedar Hollow in October of 2001. He was 81, his wife had passed 2 years prior, and his children had lives elsewhere. He called me into his office, the same one I now use, and told me he'd been watching me for 20 years and knew I was the right person for the place. He sold it to me below market value because he wanted it to go to someone who would run it right, not a development group that would tear it down and put up condominiums. I had to use everything I'd saved over 2 decades as the down payment. The night we signed the papers, my wife and I sat on the dock in the dark and she said, "Now we have to make it work." I said, "We already did." She laughed and said that was the kind of thing only an optimist says before they have to make payroll for the first time. The first 3 years weren't easy. We had soft seasons, a competing resort that opened 20 miles north, and one November where the boiler failed completely. We've been debt-free since 2009. My wife got her diagnosis in 2013. Pancreatic cancer, caught late. She was 54. We had 14 months from the diagnosis to the end, and she worked the lodge for most of them. She said sitting home feeling sick was worse than working, and the work kept her grounded, and I believed her because she was the most honest person I have ever known. She passed on a Wednesday morning in April in the bedroom of the house up the hill. I was there. Our son was there. He had driven up from the city the night before, and I am grateful every day he made it in time. After she passed, my son and I handled grief the way men in my family tend to, badly and separately. He went back to the city. I went back to work. We talked on the phone, but those conversations had the texture of two people orbiting the same loss from opposite sides, unable to find the angle where they could see each other. He moved into commercial real estate. He was good at it. He called on my birthday and on holidays and sometimes in between. I didn't push. I'd watched my own father push too hard on my brother after a falling out, and they spent the last decade of my father's life in a standoff neither of them chose, but neither could end. I didn't want that. So when my son called 2 weeks before this past Saturday and said he and his wife wanted to come up, said they were in a rough patch and needed family time, I understood that reaching out cost him something. I had my lawyer pull up the trust documents before we'd even finished the call. It had been sitting there for 2 years, waiting for me to decide I was ready. The call made me ready. I thought about my wife, who would have already been planning the menu and airing the good sheets and calling the kitchen about his favorite meal. I cleaned the corner room myself. I asked the kitchen to set aside 2 of the dry-aged ribeyes for Saturday dinner. I put fresh towels on the rack and the cedar candles from the gift shop that my wife always liked. I wanted it to feel like coming home. I should tell you about the lodge itself, because it matters to the rest of this. Cedar Hollow sits on 160 acres in western Pennsylvania, most of it forested, with about 12 acres around the buildings themselves. The main lodge, 2 outbuildings, and a small caretaker's cottage at the edge of the tree line where my groundskeeper Marcus has lived for 14 years. The property runs down to a lake that Earl Whitestone stocked in the early 1960s. The lake sits in a natural bowl in the hillside, and in the fall, when the maples are going, the reflections in the water look like something a painter would make up, because reality doesn't actually do that, but it does. The main lodge is 3 stories of hand-cut cedar logs in the original structure, with 2 additions from the late 70s. We have 38 rooms, a dining room that seats 64, a bar that seats 16, a private room that seats 20, and a lobby with a stone fireplace that stands 8 feet tall and is wide enough to roast a deer in, which Earl claimed to have done once for a hunting party in 1962, though whether that's true or legend I can't tell you. The fireplace is the thing people mention in every review. It is the first thing my wife mentioned when I brought her here for the first time. The staff is the thing I am most proud of. Donna has tended bar for 11 years and knows the regulars by name, drink order, and family situation without needing to be prompted. My general manager, Bill, has been with me 22 years and knows the operation as well as I do, which I've told him is the specific reason I can sleep at night. My head housekeeper, Renata, has run her department since 2009, with the efficiency of someone who understands that clean rooms are not just a business requirement, but a form of hospitality, a way of saying to a stranger, "You are welcome here. We prepared for you." Tony has been my head chef 16 years and has had 7 job offers from other places in that time, each of which he told me about after declining them. I know these people. When Renata's husband had his accident in 2017 and was out of work 4 months, I continued her benefits at full rate. When Tony's daughter got into culinary school in 2021 and he wasn't sure he could cover tuition, I structured a no-interest loan around his salary increases. I'm not telling you this to sound generous. I'm telling you because this is the place my son's wife looked at and called liquidity, and I want you to understand exactly what that means. I had been up since 5 that Saturday morning, the way I always am. I do a walkthrough every morning before the staff arrives in full, checking the dining room setup, making sure the lobby fireplace was stocked, confirming deliveries had been properly inventoried. My wife used to come down sometimes and do it with me. She'd bring 2 mugs and we'd move through the building without talking much, just together. I still feel her in those early mornings, not in a supernatural way, just in the way a place where someone lived and worked for a long time holds their shape in it. You can feel where they were. My son and his wife pulled in at 11:04. The BMW was silver, 5 Series, with a small dent in the rear quarter panel that looked like an unaddressed parking garage encounter. She got out before the engine was fully off, in a cream wool coat and sunglasses she didn't need because the morning was flat gray. She stood in the gravel and looked at the lodge for 15 seconds. The look was not impressed and not appalled. It was the look of someone calculating. My son came around the car. He gave me a hug that lasted about a second and a half. He called me Pop the first time in a while. He used to call me Daddy, then Dad, and then for a long stretch after his mother died, he called me nothing at all in that specific way of starting sentences without direct address when you can't commit to what to call someone. Pop meant something. I held on to it. I showed them to the corner room, 3rd floor, windows on 2 sides, lake and tree line, a gas fireplace, a sitting area my wife had arranged in 2004 that I have kept exactly as she left it. The room was clean, the good linens, the firewood stacked, dried fall flowers on the dresser from the farm down the road. His wife walked in and looked around in that assessing way. She looked at the windows, which are older, single pane in the original section. She looked at the sitting area furniture, which is not new. She looked at the clawfoot tub, which guests consistently cite as a highlight. She said, "It's cozy, the way you'd describe a studio apartment to someone who asked if you liked it and you want to be polite about your answer." My son stood at the window looking at the lake. He said, "It's beautiful up here, Pop," and his voice was unguarded in a way that people's voices rarely are when they're being watched by their spouses. I noticed that. She came down for lunch alone while my son took a call outside, spotted me at the window table where I was doing my Saturday refill of the salt and pepper shakers. She walked over without hesitation. "Excuse me," she said. "My father-in-law owns this property. White wine, please. Dry, not the cheap stuff." "Of course," I said. Donna was about to say good morning by name when I caught her eye and shook my head once. She read it immediately and poured the Sancerre without a word. I carried the glass back and set it down. She didn't look up. Then she tapped the table surface. "There's a smudge. Could you get that?" I looked. There was nothing there. I had wiped this table at 7 that morning. I got out my rag and I wiped the area she indicated. When I straightened up, she was holding out the 5. "You can use this. I appreciate honest work." My son came in and sat across from her. They talked about a contractor dispute back home, the cost of repair work, the audacity of people who charged what they charged. She gestured in my direction. "I gave him a tip," she said, "for the table. That's how it should work." My son glanced my way. Something moved across his face for one moment and then passed. He looked away. I went to the back office. The back office is a 12 by 14 room behind the dry storage corridor in the basement. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet I've been meaning to replace for 7 years, a whiteboard for maintenance items, and the monitor for the security system. We installed cameras 8 years ago after a guest accused one of my housekeepers of stealing. The watch turned up in the guest's own bag 2 days later, but she had already cried in my office, and I decided that was never happening again. Cameras in every public space. Audio too, ever since a billing dispute in 2019. I pulled up the dining room feed and scrolled to noon. I turned the audio up. I watched her order the wine. I watched the exchange with the 5. Then my son sat down and I listened. His dad's going to do the trust speech tonight. Then we smile, say thank you, and the day it's in our name, we call a real estate broker. The whole rustic thing isn't us. We want liquidity. The staff's been there a long time. That's not our problem. A buyer will handle that. That's what employment contracts are for. Yeah, I want to be precise about that last word, because it is the part that did the most damage. Not her plan. Her plan told me who she was, and that was clarifying information. The yeah told me who my son had been becoming without my noticing. He didn't protest. He didn't say wait, or I'm not sure, or that doesn't sit right with me. He said yeah, single syllable. The verbal equivalent of a door closing quietly, and he let it close. I sat in the dark office for a long while after that. I looked at the maintenance whiteboard. 7 items. Weather stripping on the east exit, a shutter latch in room 14, grout in room 22, the loose dock board, the flickering parking lot light, water pressure in the caretaker's cottage, a linen supplier discrepancy. 7 items that represented the continuous, unglamorous work of keeping a place functional. What my son's wife had looked at when she saw all of that, 38 years of it, was a transaction waiting to happen. I was not in a rage sitting in that office. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was not anger. It was clarity. The specific kind that arrives when something forces you to stop completely and look at where you actually are. Not where you'd hope to be heading. Where you are. I knew what I had to do before I stood up. I made 3 calls from the back office. The first was to my general manager, Bill, 22 years on the property, currently doing quarterly accounts on the 2nd floor. I told him I needed him in the private dining room in half an hour and to not be late for it. Bill has worked with me long enough to understand that phrasing. He said he'd be there. The second was to Donna, same message, and to pass the word to Renata at the front desk. The third was to my lawyer, Martin Cass, who has represented me since 1991 and whom I trust with every significant decision I make. Martin keeps a cabin half a mile up the access road from the lodge and comes down most weekends. I knew his truck was in the back lot from the morning walkthrough. "Martin," I said, "private dining room, half an hour. Bring the estate portfolio." He said, "I'll be there." Then I went back out and walked up to their table. I stood there. "Excuse me," I said. "When you have a moment, there's something in the private dining room I'd like to go over with you both." She looked at me, then at my son. She said, "Of course, my father-in-law will be joining us." I said, "I'm aware." I walked away before she could respond. The private dining room is at the far end of the 1st floor, separated from the main dining room by the service corridor and a pair of heavy oak doors that my wife chose in 2007 when we refinished that wing. She chose them because they are solid enough to make a room feel genuinely private, and because she liked the grain pattern on the panels. They're beautiful doors, heavy. When you pull them shut, the sound is a kind of finality, not harsh, just complete. By the time I got there, Bill was already in his seat at the long table, his reading glasses on, a legal pad in front of him out of habit. Bill keeps notes on everything. He has been keeping notes on everything for 22 years. If I ever need to know what the weather was on a specific October Tuesday in 2014, Bill's notes probably have it. He looked at me when I came in and didn't ask anything yet. He's learned when to ask and when to wait. Donna came in 2 minutes later, still in her bar apron, and sat down at the far side of the table. She looked at the 2 of us and at the empty chairs and said, "Are we waiting for more people?" I told her we were. She nodded and folded her hands. Martin arrived in his weekend clothes, canvas pants, a flannel shirt not entirely unlike mine, reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He set his portfolio on the table and looked at me. I gave him a brief summary of what had happened, just the facts. He listened without expression. When I finished, he opened the portfolio without comment and looked at the documents inside. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want to talk through options, or have you already decided?" I said I'd already decided. He said, "Then let me check a few things in here and I'll be ready when they come in." Renata came last. She's worked the front desk for 14 years and has a way of moving through a building that generates no attention whatsoever, which is a skill skill worth considerably more than most people understand. She sat between Donna and Bill and looked at me the way she always does when something serious is happening, which is directly and without unnecessary expression. I told them briefly what they were there for. I told them I was going to play a recording and then speak to my son and his wife, and I wanted the staff present as witnesses and as a way of making the situation's seriousness legible. I wasn't interested in theater. I was interested in clarity. I wanted my son's wife to understand that the people who heard what she had said were not abstract. They were Donna, who has poured her drinks for the past day. They were Bill, who has kept this business solvent for 2 decades. They were Renata, who smiled at her when she checked in. I wanted the gap between who my son's wife thought these people were and who they actually were to be visible in the room. Everyone understood. Nobody asked me to explain further. That is the thing about people who have worked somewhere for a long time under someone they trust. They don't need everything explained. They can read the shape of a situation. My son and his wife came in about 8 minutes later. She pushed the door open herself, which meant she came in ahead of him. She stopped when she saw the room, the table, the people. Martin, in particular, seemed to register. He has the look of a person with authority even in weekend clothes, which is the specific kind of authority that comes from having exercised it for 40 years. She scanned the table, then looked at me, and her expression did a complicated thing where several possible responses competed for her face simultaneously. "What is this?" she said. "Have a seat," I said. She sat. My son came in behind her, looked at the people at the table, looked at me, and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He had the look he used to have as a child when he'd come home from school knowing something had happened and not yet knowing how much I knew about it. I set the laptop on the table. I had brought it from the office, already cued to the clip. I turned the screen toward them, reached over, and hit play. The audio came up at full volume in a quiet room. "His dad's going to do the whole trust thing tonight, you know? We smile, we nod, we let him do the ceremony. Then the day it's in our name, we call a real estate broker. This whole rustic thing is charming for a weekend, but it's not a life. We don't want a business. We want liquidity. The staff's been there a long time. That's not our problem. A buyer will handle that. That's what employment contracts are for." Yeah, I let the clip play another 5 seconds of ambient dining room sound, then closed it. The room was quiet. I don't mean merely quiet in the usual sense. I mean the specific quality of silence that occurs when several people have just heard something and nobody is moving and the weight of what was said is still settling into the air. Bill had set down his pen. Donna was looking at the table. Renata had her hands folded in front of her in the exact position they'd been in before the clip started. But something in her face had changed in a way that was very small and very certain. My son's face had gone a color I had not seen on a person outside of medical contexts. His wife's face had gone through a rapid sequence: surprise, then calculation, then something that was trying to organize itself into indignation. "That is a private conversation," she said. "You cannot record people without their consent." Martin cleared his throat gently, the way he does when he is about to explain something and wants it to be clear that he is explaining, not arguing. He said, "This is a privately owned commercial property. There is signage at every entrance and at the base of every stairwell indicating that the property operates a security monitoring system with audio capability. When you checked in this morning, you signed a guest registration card. The card includes a standard acknowledgement of the property's recording policy. A copy of that card is in this portfolio. Additionally, in this state, audio recording in a location that is open to the public, such as a hotel dining room, does not require the consent of any party being recorded because no reasonable expectation of privacy exists in such a space. You were in a hotel dining room during operating hours, at a table where other guests were seated within 20 feet of you." He paused. "She has," he said, "a thin expectation of privacy, legally speaking." My son's wife stared at Martin, then at me. She opened her mouth and closed it. My son was still not speaking. He was looking at the middle of the table. I sat down at the head of the table. I had deliberately remained standing until this point, and I sat now because I wanted to be at eye level with my son for what came next. "Son," I said, "I want to tell you something that I had planned to tell you tonight at dinner in the main room by the fireplace. I chose that spot because it was your mother's favorite place in this building, and because I thought she would have wanted to be present for it in whatever way she can still be present for things." He looked up. His eyes were wet. "I had something prepared for you," I said. "I had a trust document in my office that transfers Cedar Hollow Lodge, the land, the buildings, the business, all of it, to you at the time of my death. It also includes a fund, $150,000, set aside for any children you and your wife might have, for their education. I have been carrying that fund in the plan for 3 years, set aside out of our reserves, earning interest, waiting for grandchildren who haven't arrived yet." I was hopeful. His wife made a sound. Not a word. Something smaller, like the beginning of a word that lost its nerve. I told him that the trust would not be signed as written. He closed his eyes. I am not going to spend a long time on what happened next, because it is private to him in a way that even this account cannot claim. He cried, not dramatically, quietly, the way men of his generation and mine tend to cry, with everything held in except what can't be held. His wife tried twice to interject, once to say it had been a private conversation, once to say people say things in private they don't mean, and I held up my hand both times and waited until the room was quiet again before I continued. I told him what I had heard and what the silence following it had told me. I told him I wasn't doing this out of of anger, and I meant it. I told him that what his wife had said told me who she was, and that my son's silence told me something I needed to understand about who he had become. I told him that the staff in this room, I didn't gesture at them, I let the statement stand, were not abstractions. They were the people whose livelihoods his wife had described as something a buyer would handle, and they deserved to be here for this. Donna was still looking at the table. Renata was looking at me. Bill had his hands flat on the legal pad and was looking at my son with an expression that was not unkind and not forgiving either, just present. Martin had his portfolio closed and his hands folded on it. I reached into my shirt pocket. I took out the $5 bill. I set it on the table in front of his wife. "The lodge takes care of me," I said. "It always has." She looked at the bill. She did not touch it. Martin opened his portfolio. He explained in his careful, measured voice that the trust would be revised, that the lodge and associated property would, upon my death, transfer to a charitable foundation, that the foundation's mandate would be scholarships for children of hospitality and service industry workers in the county, that a separate committee was being assembled to govern the foundation, and that I had already identified 3 candidates for that committee who were not family members, that all gifts previously made to my son, his graduate school loans, which I had paid down by $40,000 in 2018, the contribution toward his wedding, and the $60,000 toward the down payment on his home in 2022, were his to keep, structured as gifts at the time and remaining as such. There would be no clawback. That was not who I was, and I wanted him to know it wasn't. His wife's hands went flat on the table. She looked at Martin. She looked at me. She started to say something about what she was owed, about the years of effort, about what a marriage to a man means in terms of the family she had joined. I waited for her to finish. Then I said, "You are not owed this place. Nobody is. And what you are owed by the years of your marriage to my son is something between the two of you, and I wish you well in sorting it out." I stood up. I thanked Donna, Renata, and Bill, and told them to go back to the floor. Donna squeezed my shoulder as she passed. That was all. Martin stayed, as I'd asked. I looked at my son one more time. I told him I loved him. I told him I would always love him. I told him that none of this changed the shape of what I felt for him, that the love of a parent for a child is not a reward system. It does not increase when the child is good and decrease when they are not. It just is, like weather, like the property line, like the fact of the lake being there. I told him my door was open. I told him that if he ever wanted to write to me, I would read every word. I told him that if he wanted to write without his wife looking over his shoulder, if he wanted to write me as the boy I raised, not the man the last several years had been making him into, I would read that letter more than once. He nodded twice, very slowly, like a man receiving information he was going to have to sit with for a long time before he could do anything with it. Then I asked them to check out. I told them there was no charge for the room or for lunch. I thanked them for making the drive. Then I walked out of the private dining room and through the main dining room, where the dinner crew was beginning to set up for the evening service, and out the front door of the lodge, and down the porch steps, and across the gravel drive, and down the path to the dock. The dock is a 60-foot structure at the water's edge, built by Earl in 1963, and repaired many times since. At the end is a bench, 4 feet wide, with back and arm rests. My wife's name is carved into the underside of the seat, not the top, where a stranger sitting down would see it. The underside. I did it myself 2 years after she passed, with a woodworking chisel from the maintenance shed, the way you leave something in a place you intend to return to. I went out to the end of the dock and sat with my hand flat on the wood over where her name is. The lake was flat that afternoon. Late October, no wind. The surface had the texture of pewter. Most of the fall color was past its peak, and what remained had the deeper quality of the late season. The burgundies and rusted oranges that come after the bright yellows have dropped. If the clouds held the way they looked like they'd hold, the sun was going to find its gap at the horizon in a few minutes, and everything on the water would go gold. My wife called it the 10 minutes. She said it was the best argument she knew against Rush. I thought about her. I do this in the way that is different from missing her, though I miss her every day. Thinking about her is more active. I replay things she said. I ask her what she would make of something. I have a detailed model of her opinions at this point, built from 34 years of paying close attention. And while I understand this is not the same as having her here, it is not nothing. What she would have made of the afternoon, exactly what I made of it, and she would have acted sooner. My wife read people faster and more accurately than I do. She would have known within the first hour. She would have said something to me in private in that way of hers, framing an observation as a question, so I arrived at the conclusion myself. I thought about my son, specifically the 8-year-old version, who sat at the corner table doing his homework and once told me on a Friday evening that he'd noticed how the light in the lobby changed at 4 o'clock and asked me if I'd ever timed it. He was not the kind of child who said a lot, but what he said was usually accurate. That boy is still in there somewhere. I believe that. The voice when he looked out the window and said, "It's beautiful up here, unguarded, honest, no performance in it." That was him. The years have put things on top of it, but it is still there. People get buried. It happens gradually and rarely dramatically until the moment it is, and by then you're usually looking at the accumulation of a long time. I don't think my son is a bad person. I think he is someone who has spent the years since his mother died in the company of a person who moves through the world in a specific way, and you become, over time, the shape of the container you're in. The person you're with is always, slowly, either building you or diminishing you, and if you're not paying attention, it can go a long way before you notice. I sat sat on the dock until the gold came. It came at around 4:50, the light finding its gap and spreading across the water the way it does in October. Everything went gold. The dock, my hands, the far bank, the bench under me. 9 minutes. Then the ridge swallowed the sun, and the gray came back, and it was just a lake again. A beautiful lake. Just a lake. I got up and walked back to the lodge. Renata came to the kitchen around 7:30. She said, quietly, they checked out at 6:15. The room was left clean. He left the 5 on the dresser. I nodded. He looked back before he got in the car, she said, toward the building. I didn't respond to that. After a moment, she went back to the front desk. I worked in the office until around 10, then did the end-of-day walkthrough. Fireplace damper, side door locks, thermostat in the main hall. Everything was where it should be. I put on my coat and walked up the hill to the house. The house is a 1940s farmhouse my wife and I bought in 1986 for $62,000. The kitchen is the room she spent the most time in. I keep the cookware in the same places she kept it. I have bought new pots twice since she passed and put them away in exactly the same locations as the old ones. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. I thought about the letter I'm going to write my son. It will say that I love him. It will say that love of the kind a parent has for a child does not work on a reward system. It does not increase when the child is good and decrease when they are not. It just is. The way the property line is, the way the lake is. It will say, I am not angry. That I am, and I want to be precise, disappointed, not in him as a person, but in the shape his life seems to have taken. Because the boy who noticed the light changing at 4 o'clock in the lobby had something in him worth more than liquidity, and I believe he still has it. It will say the door is open, that he can come up whenever he wants, however he wants, with whomever he wants. I will make no demands on the circumstances. It will say I would like to hear from him, not an apology, not a reconciliation letter, just a letter, the kind you write when you actually want to say something rather than when you're managing a situation. If he writes me that kind of letter, I will write him back, and we'll see where it goes. I'll write it when I'm ready. A few weeks. I need some distance first. Need the feelings to settle out of the acute stage into something I can look at directly. In the meantime, I got up the next morning at 5. I made coffee. I put on my flannel shirt. I walked down the hill to the lodge and unlocked the building and stood in the lobby for a moment in the early quiet and looked at the fireplace. Then I got the salt and pepper shakers from the service corridor cabinet and started my Saturday round of the tables. When Donna came in at 8, she said good morning in the particular way that was checking on me without asking directly if I was all right. I said good morning back in the way that told her I was. She nodded. She went to the bar. We got on with it. That's what you do. The rooms need to be clean. The tables need to be right. The fire needs to be laid before the guests come down for breakfast. The dock has a loose board on the 3rd plank from the right, and somebody needs to call the contractor. The parking lot light needs its connection tightened. The grout in room 22 needs resealing. There is always something to take care of. That is not a lament. It is the whole point. You build something. You take care of it. You show up every morning and do the work. You pay attention to the small things because the small things are not small. They are the difference between a place that works and a place that doesn't. Between somewhere people return to and somewhere they just pass through once. You treat the people who work for you the way you'd want someone to treat the people you love. You treat the people who walk through your door the way you'd want someone to treat you if you were tired and far from home and needed somewhere to land. You do that every day for 38 years, and what you build is not just a business, not just a lodge, and then you make sure it ends up in the right hands, whatever that takes.